Good evening and welcome to the Kuhn Academy, where we're building responsible voters one video at a time. All right, this installment is going to be about federalism and the courts. Now, hopefully for homework tonight, you're reading either Gonzalez versus Raich or U.S. versus Lopez. All right, these are critical cases on the courts and the sort of shifting balance between federal and state powers. All right, so when we look at the involvement of the government here, we're either going to look at the courts sort of favoring the states or the courts favoring the national government. All right. Now, starting out, we have a very nation-centered court. All right. That's the court under John Marshall, who most of his rulings are favoring the national government, strengthening its power mostly through the Commerce and Elastic Clause. All right. So we start to see some power from the federal government. Then we see a big shift to the state-centered courts for nearly 100 years, okay, with the exception of the Civil War and the 14th Amendment. For the most part, the courts are favoring the states, granting them more states' rights, striking down federal laws unconstitutional, and so on. The 1937 is a key date to remember. We call that the first constitutional revolution because what's happening is the courts are finally starting to uphold some power from the government and some programs such as the New Deal, all right, into the Great Society that give the federal government more power over the states and dictate policies and things like that. And in recent cases, 93 is another turning point year. That's the year of U.S. versus Lopez that you're reading. And you'll see how that starts to shift the balance of power a little bit. And right now we're kind of seeing the power shifting back in the other direction. All right, so as we take a look here, we're just going to walk through a timeline. All right, starting in 1819, all right, is our first real significant case involving the courts, okay? That's McCulloch versus Maryland. And in this one, the court essentially is ruling on the national bank. You should remember this from U.S. history last year, or at least in AP US. And what happens here is the state of Maryland is trying to tax the bank, okay? So in an effort to limit federal power. So what ends up happening is the courts end up ruling two things. Okay, number one, they say that Congress has implied powers under the Constitution or the Elastic Clause, so they can do other things besides what's stated in the Constitution. It implies that they can do other activities. So since they can coin money, which is an enumerated power, it is implied then that they can create a bank to obviously distribute that money. All right, and then the other thing they rule on is the Supremacy Clause. They rule that the power to tax is the power to destroy. And that's a Marshall quote. And what he's essentially saying here is that the national government has the power to create this bank, and that's supreme over the states. And if the states tax the bank, that's going to destroy the bank, and the states do not have that power. Okay, so it strengthens the Elastic Clause and the Supremacy Clause. Critical case, makes the exam nearly every year. Okay, and not so important of a case, but still sometimes makes the exam, is Gibbons versus Ogden. This is a Commerce Clause case. All right, this dealt with steamboats on the Hudson River in New York and whether or not Congress could regulate that activity, because basically a monopoly was granted to somebody to transport people between New York and New Jersey, and that was interstate commerce, and Congress said that that was not the state's jurisdiction. So the courts essentially say that commerce between states can be regulated. It clarifies the Commerce Clause, okay, which some people had read to just mean Congress could regulate trade between other nations, but this now said they can regulate trade between the states. Critical case to strengthening the power. Now, after the Civil War and passage of the 14th Amendment, all right, we have a shift of power because the 14th Amendment says no state shall deny anybody life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, that is essentially the federal government taking over state relations, because just about anything a state does could limit your life, liberty, or property. So there was a series of cases called the Slaughterhouse Cases. This was a class action suit against the slaughterhouses down in Louisiana. And making a very long story short, essentially the court limits the use of the 14th Amendment, and it does not protect citizens from state actions. There's also a Cruikshank case, same thing. It says you're protected from the state actions but not the individual actions. But this essentially prevented the government from regulating activity down there in Louisiana and kind of clarified what the 14th Amendment said. All right, now our revolution, and slaughterhouse cases don't make the exam, it's pretty tricky, but it just starts to shift the power a little bit and clarify how the 14th Amendment is supposed to be read. Moving along to 1937. All right, FDR kind of takes on the Supreme Court. Now we know all about Roosevelt's New Deal and how that's an attempt to help the people with new programs, new policies, and so on, to help get us out of the Depression. Well, the court had struck a few of his initial policies down as unconstitutional, arguing that it was not interstate commerce and the government could not regulate these activities such as agriculture, wages, and things like that. So what Roosevelt does is he tries to pack the court with 6 new justices. All right, he essentially declares war on the court in an attempt to win public opinion. All right, because most of the cases that he's arguing, he's losing 7-2. Okay, because these are old conservative judges that had been around since before Roosevelt and appointed by the earlier Republican predecessors. So Roosevelt says, I'm going to appoint 6 new judges. Now, he doesn't just randomly pick 6 judges. Now, if you can figure out if he's losing 7-2 and he appoints 6 new judges, he's now winning 8-7. It's not why he's going to do it. All right. What he's saying is every judge over 70, we're going to appoint a new judge to replace them. So that way, when they retire or pass away, we have a new judge ready to take over, and the court will be able to continue its business. But we know what he's really trying to do. Okay, and plan ends up failing. Congress doesn't approve this, and it almost looks like a dictatorial move by Roosevelt. But the court does realize that the reason Roosevelt's doing this is the public is getting upset with them, that they are not winning over the people by striking down all these policies. So Roosevelt's kind of saying, if you don't play ball with me, I can change the court, and the public is on my side. I just want a landslide election. Things are positive on my end, so start ruling my plan is constitutional or something's going to change. So later that year, in NLRB, that's National Labor Relations Board versus Jones Laughlin Steel, the court upholds the minimum wage law that Congress had set, which is kind of appropriate since we're debating that currently as well, that upholds it, saying that it's interstate commerce, government can regulate it, so any business that engages interstate commerce has to abide by the federal minimum wage. Okay, and that's the beginning of the courts trying to side with Roosevelt and rule his programs constitutional. All right, we're going to stop right there, give you a chance to catch your breath here a little bit. All right, and we hope you enjoyed listening, and we'll see you for part 2 here shortly.